the meeting.
Darren seems to be struggling.
He's trying to connect, so hopefully he'll connect very soon. Just one more minute. Thank you for your patience. He's trying to connect via phone because Zoom will not let him in. So just one more minute. Thank you. Perhaps Nazeem, you can introduce yourself, and then when Diran comes, then perhaps in the end he can.
Yes, why don't we do that? It's comforting to know that there are internet problems even in the United States, right? So,
Yes.
okay.
Thank you.
Those are our only problems, Nazeem. Those are our only
That's right.
That's also true. Look, yes, let's begin. Oh no, Darren is here. Darren is here. Maybe you'd like to say a few
Oh,
words.
Diran, can you hear? Can you? Are you able to? Can you hear us?
Yes, can you
Oh,
hear me?
perfect. Sorry. Yep, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll kick us off. I'm Dhiren Thakur, President and CEO of Med Aditus Pharmaceuticals Inc. and Med Aditus Pharmaceuticals Kenya Limited. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's session on the state of pharmaceutical manufacturing industry in Africa. As many of you know, Med Aditus Foundation, in collaboration with Med Aditus Pharmaceuticals companies, host a webinar series which we call Med Aditus Presents. And today's session is focusing on manufacturing in Africa. The government and non-government initiatives to promote local manufacturing of pharmaceutical products have been launched for at least a couple of decades now. However, the growth of local manufacturing capacity is relatively slow, and the countries in sub-Saharan Africa still depend heavily on imported drugs from India, China, Europe, elsewhere. The two events in this decade, COVID and retreat of USAID from Africa, and perhaps the rest of the world, must awaken us to the acute necessity for African countries to develop a stronger local manufacturing capacity for drugs and vaccines. Today, we have a panel of experts who have lived the reality of establishing and running pharmaceutical manufacturing companies in African countries. We look forward to their insights and their views on this very important topic. Nazeem Mohamed, who ran Kampala Pharmaceutical Industries as a CEO for many years, and who also held leadership roles in Federation of East African Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, as well as Federation of African Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, will moderate today's panel discussion. And Nazeem, I'm going to hand this program over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ziran. First of all, thank you to Med Aditus for putting up these series of chats and talks. Today is all about pharmaceutical manufacturing within Africa. I'm delighted to have two highly experienced colleagues and also my friends who will really do most of the talking today. And they will share in a very pragmatic, very sort of matter-of-fact way, a realistic way of what are the challenges and the opportunities of manufacturing in Africa. In fact, Skhumbuzo and well, let me introduce him first. I think, first of all, Emmanuel Mujuru. Emmanuel is a pharmacist by training. He is both the owner and the CEO of +5 Pharmaceuticals company in Zimbabwe. Skhumbuzo Ngozwana is from South Africa. He is the president and CEO of Kiara Health, both running very impressive, very successful pharmaceutical companies in slightly different parts of Africa. And I think it was, if I remember rightly, it was 2010. The three of us were sharing a coffee in Johannesburg at a meeting, along with a colleague from UNIDO. And in our discussions, realized that actually all the challenges that we had were almost identical. Whether you were in Nigeria, whether you were in Kenya, or as I was in Uganda, or South Africa or Zimbabwe, our challenges were almost identical. So at that time, there was no association. So we thought, look, why don't we put together an association? UNIDO were very kindly giving us some seed money to get us off the ground. So FAPMA has been around for quite a while. And I'm sure Emmanuel will talk a lot more about it. But before we go into sort of the depths of the discussion, I just want to put a few facts up so we can put this discussion into context. Very, very often, us in Africa are talking to people from outside of Africa, and they talk about Africa as if it's one country, right? So let me just remind everybody, it's 54 separate countries, sovereign countries with their own regulations, their own rules. Yes, there's a harmonization exercise going on. Yes, we got African Union, but none of it is still harmonized enough to make everything, sail smoothly. Okay, so that's one of the issues you need to remember. Other thing is we have a population of around 1.4 billion, which is the same as in India. But again, the big difference is in Africa we have a very, very young population. So there really is this demographic dividend if we can take advantage of it, right? And that's something I think in the future is going to be particularly important. However, if you look at the Indian pharmaceutical industry, I think we all know they're kings when it comes to generics globally, but they're also now getting into R&D. India, with the same population as us, has 40,000 companies. We, I think, have around 600. So a long way to go, but that's again an opportunity. The other thing that I think we forget, and it becomes important when you realize we're 54 countries, but in a very, very large area. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we look at the world map as a flat piece of paper, and you don't realize how big Africa is. Africa can actually absorb India, China, Europe, and the US, and we still have a little bit of land left. So that's how huge we are, right? So don't forget that when we talk about the logistics and the issues of moving medicines around Africa. Last thing I would like to really say is that if we were having this discussion pre-COVID, I think we would be talking about it in a different manner. COVID did a couple of things. COVID was a huge wake-up call for our heads of states, for our politicians, because we suddenly realized throughout African countries, particularly sub-Saharan African countries, we couldn't get the vaccines, or if we did, they were very late, or they were running out of expiry. we couldn't get our raw materials, our APIs. So people like Skhumbuzo and Emmanuel were struggling to make basic drugs like paracetamol. And really what happened was we were so heavily reliant, particularly from India and China, on virtually everything. Masks, gloves, you name it. So since then, there's a lot of money being put up. For instance, the African Development Bank has got $3 billion to spend on African pharma over the next 10 years. Many other DFIs have also got similar amounts of money. But what it also meant was that our politicians realized that we've got to look at supporting our local manufacturing, much more than supporting other companies. So we are seeing that move, and I'm sure both Emmanuel and Skhumbuzo will talk about that because it's definitely positive, and it'll make a huge difference going forward. So really, that's just an introduction. I'd like to leave it there. Just some housekeeping. I'm sure all of you participating will have a lot of questions to ask. Please put them on chat, and what we'll do is after we finish our presentations, we will take on those questions, okay? And we'll go on. Dylan promises me that we can go on for as long as we need to. So that's comforting. Right. Let's start with Emmanuel. What we've asked Emmanuel to do is really to talk about pharma on an African level, pharma manufacturing. What are the challenges? What are the key issues? How is it moving? And of course, with his experience, particularly as the chairman of FAPMA, he has a tremendous amount of knowledge, and I'm sure will enlighten a lot of people listening to this presentation. Emmanuel, you've got about 20 minutes, okay? Over to you.
All right. Thanks, Nazeem. It's good to be here, and thank you very much for inviting FAPMA to be part of this discussion, which is very stimulating. Let me just go straight into my discussion. I need then to give you a brief introduction about FAPMA. FAPMA stands for the Federation of African Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, which is a continental body that represents manufacturers in Africa. Our vision is to be a viable industry that produces quality, affordable medicines in order to reduce the disease burden, improve the quality of life, and contribute to scientific and economic development of the continent. And we do that through advocacy and partnership in order to address common challenges facing manufacturers on the continent, as well as realize opportunities towards self-sufficiency. And we do it through advocacy and partnership with various stakeholders that are occupying or operating in the African pharmaceutical space. And I think before I go deep into the analysis of the pharmaceutical industry on the continent, it is important that I put into perspective the African pharmaceutical market so that you have an appreciation of what we're talking about. Nazeem spoke about the 54 countries with a population as big as India, and but not as homogeneous as India, and also various barriers, and it's basically a fragmented market. And all efforts towards ensuring that Africa produces its own medicines towards opening up a common market so that we can then be able to realize the full potential of the African market and also build viable enterprises that are able to operate in that space. The African market is estimated to be about 27 to 30 billion in size, and with about 1.3 billion people, and with a GDP of 3 trillion. It's growing at a rate of about 3.74% compound annual growth rate, which means it is estimated to be going to reach about 38 billion by 2033. It is also important to take note that Africa imports almost 95% of the APIs and produce about 30% of its medicines, and 30 to 40% in terms of volume demand. To that extent, there's still a lot of space that the industry in Africa has to play in order to reach the levels of self-sufficiency, as well as ensure that we establish health security in Africa. There's been a noticeable growth in terms of non-communicable diseases, which currently accounting for about 37% of the deaths in Africa. And it is estimated to contribute about 35% by 2030, if I'm correct. And then HIV/AIDS is also a key pandemic issue, accounting for almost 25.6 million people living with HIV, which means they require daily treatment on ARV treatment. And coming into perspective in terms of the African market and also the industry per se, there are 54 countries. Pharmaceutical production is taking place in about 38 countries. Those 38 countries, about 10 countries contribute about 75% of the total production in terms of volume and value as well. And the concentration is mostly in North Africa, East Africa, and West Africa to some extent. So there's still, and the production is actually limited mostly to generic products, oral solid dosage forms, liquid dosage forms, and creams. And there's limited production in terms of innovative technologies and also complex formulations that include your biosimilars, your vaccines, and also other products as well, and including oncology products. There's a limited production of that as well. But there's massive demand in terms of growth of these products. So that also needs to be addressed when you're looking at growing the African pharmaceutical market and ensuring that the local companies significantly contribute to production of pharmaceutical products. And I think it is also important to take note that the African manufacturers, most of them are operating at below 50% capacity utilization, and which is, to a great extent, makes it very difficult for them to achieve the levels of viability that ensures that they become competitive in producing medicines for Africa. And also, I think it is also important to take note that given the growing demand and the situation, especially after the experiences we had with COVID-19, there came a realization at political level by African governments that in order to establish health security for the continent, we have to ensure that we produce most of our medicines. And as a result, President Dr. William Ruto of Kenya was then appointed as the champion to grow the champion for pharma industry and local production. And at the last AU meeting, which took place last month, they made a declaration that by 2050, Africa should be producing over 60% of its medicines. And I think in order to reach that and to establish that milestone, there's need to look at what needs to be done within the African context to ensure that we are able to address the concerns and the requirements of our people. It is our responsibility as Africans to produce our medicines and not rely on someone else to take care of the health of our people. And it is something that as local manufacturers and at both national and continental level have taken to heart. So the key requirements, and I'm just talking from my experiences and also from at both at running a pharmaceutical company and also at continental level. One needs then to look at how then do we realize the demand that is already there, which I said is currently being utilized at a capacity of below 50%. And that's a low-hanging fruit that needs then to be taken advantage of. And in order to do that, I think one needs to look at the market shaping policies, to look at how we can then create demand for capacity that is already there. And out of the 30 billion that I mentioned, there is also the donations account for more than 10%, which is roughly about 3 billion. And we have got 7 African manufacturers that have achieved WHOPQ, but most of them, it's a very costly exercise to the extent that most of them are not realizing the investment in upgrading their facilities to the WHO PQ level. And so there's need to address the procurement policies of the donor community so that they are accessible to the African manufacturers. And as FAPMA, we have been looking at other considerations, not only relying on WHO PQ as a qualification point for buying from African manufacturers. And we have seen of late that there has been a massive investment in regulatory systems, strengthening, and the achievement of MO3 by about 9 regulators in Africa, and also the establishment of FAPMA as a continental regulatory authority that will then be responsible for licensing and registration of products at a continental level. So there's need for recognition of that, so that all those manufacturers that have achieved MO3 or so forth in countries that have been licensed by national regulatory authorities that have achieved MO3 can be able to access the donor donations, and also increase the reliance among regulatory authorities, those that have achieved the MO3, so that they recognize others that have also achieved the same. And from that would then stem the from that we can then be able to see an acceleration in harmonization and the creation of a common market. And I think also it's important to most of the manufacturers are facing challenges of accessing funding, which is not very much available. In some countries, yes, one can talk of there being it's readily accessible, but other countries, most of the countries, finance is a major challenge. And we've seen and we realize and acknowledge the effort by Africa Development Bank, put in place the 3 billion for African manufacturers. But I think there's need to customize that and structure it in a way that it is accessible to manufacturers and take into account the concerns and the challenges that African manufacturers face in that respect. And so it's something that we've been advocating on, in addition to market shaping policies. And tech transfer is always very significant. As I mentioned, most of the manufacturers are producing simple generics and simple dosage forms, the oral solid dosage forms, liquid dosage forms, and creams and other external preparations. There's little or non-production in terms of APIs. And where we've seen local companies investing in API production, it is mostly through vertical integration, where they first of all want to produce for their own consumption after realizing that the volumes or the values of the APIs that they're importing are such that it can sustain setting up an API production facility. So we've seen a trend moving in that direction because then they are able to secure their own markets. And so we see a trend moving in that direction. After taking care of their own requirements, then they can look at supplying other manufacturers. And that normally is being focused on APIs that are low volume and high value, and where you don't need massive injection in capital, and where you don't rely mostly on economies of scale, which applies to most of the commodities. So that's one of the, so there is API production that is going up. And I think also in technological transfer, the production of complex molecules, your oncology products, and your vaccines, and biosimilars, that's also an area of growth that Africa is looking at. And we've seen a lot of investment in that. And also it is important to take note that it is the fastest growing market in Africa. Demand is growing at an exponential rate. So it's a viable investment to go into that. And it's important that African manufacturers look into that. And the opening up of the markets, which is taking place at a continental level through initiatives of the African Continental Free Trade Area, is also removing barriers, non-tariff barriers that was making it difficult for Africa to move medicines between states. And also to note that Africa, from the last statistics that we've got, accounts for almost trades within levels of 30%, 13% with each other, which means almost 87% of the trade is with the outside world, and 13% is only done between African states. So the removal of non-tariff barriers and other barriers that makes it difficult and expensive to move medicines and other products between African states. That is also being addressed through the initiatives of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And it's something that, too, as FAPMA, we're riding on that. And we've also seen key players coming into the African market, the strengthening and the growth of the Africa CDC, which has become a major player, was becoming a major player in the African market. And the good thing is that they're also prioritizing and looking at how they can buy more medicines from African manufacturers. And as FAPMA, we're also working with them so that we can see what we can do to address and ensure that we go in that direction. So in a way, I think call for action, there's need to make funding available and accessible to African manufacturers and remove the challenges that makes it, or that is making it difficult for African manufacturers to access funding, and to open up the markets and the donor community buying more from African manufacturers. And we have a situation where they buy less than 10% of the medicines that are being donated into Africa, and where 90% is coming from outside. So there's potential for them to buy more from Africa and also realize and appreciate the improving of the quality regulatory systems in Africa that is making it possible for African manufacturers to reach the level of quality that gives them the assurance that the products that they're buying from Africa are the acceptable standards. And also, I think we've seen African governments, there's a lot of political will that has been put, that is in place now, as opposed to 20 or 30 years ago, when it was very difficult to convince even our own governments that it is viable to produce in Africa. But I think it's almost common cause that everyone accepts that Africa can produce its own medicines. I think now what is required is the how. How do we then do that? And also there is important that for African governments to buy more from their local manufacturers and not just look at price consideration as a decision, as a decider in deciding where to buy from, because there are other costs that are involved, economic cost and the health security risks that is raised by relying on outside. And we saw it COVID. COVID was a wake-up call. And the question is, how do we stay awake? And I think that's what we need to be seized with at the moment. And tech transfer, as I mentioned, is also an important area that open avenues for partnerships between African manufacturers and the outside world. And I'm not sure whether my 20 minutes is up or there's still got time.
We're okay. We're okay, Emmanuel. Carry on. We're okay.
So that's and I think partnerships also between African manufacturers that we have seen, and we've been encouraging companies in North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, collaborating, going to partnerships and contract manufacture, distribution, and so forth. So those are really gaining traction on the African continent, and it's something that is very encouraging in that respect. And I think it's also important to note that in other African countries, 1 or 2 African countries, they've achieved almost 90% of local production. And if you trace to why that has been achieved and how they've managed to do that, and it is through putting in place the right policies. It's not that African companies are not able to produce for the continent, but I think it takes a lot of effort, a lot of commitment at government level, at regional level, and continental level to ensure that that is achieved. If I can quote one Indian professor who came out with a quote that the failure for African companies or African countries to produce their own medicines, it's not that African manufacturers are incapable. It's because they're not doing enough to ensure that that is achieved. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Just one quick question for me, just for clarification purposes for our audience. Could you just talk a little bit about the relationship of FAPMA with both African Union CDC and also the Global Fund, please? Thanks.
Okay. You mean with the Africa CDC? Yeah, with the Global Fund, we are an advocacy group, as I mentioned. So we've been engaging Global Fund, and at one time we had a meeting with them, and basically influence their decision-making processes or policies, and to move them away from the insistence on WHOPQ, which we believe was put in place mostly because the regulatory systems in Africa were deemed not to be sufficient enough to guarantee the production of quality medicines. But as I mentioned, there's a massive shift in strengthening regulatory systems to the extent that the regulatory oversight that is in place gives the assurance that the medicines are now able to reach almost international standards. But it was also important to note that, as I mentioned, 9 NRAs, National Regulatory Authorities, have managed to achieve ML3. Other continents, even in India and so forth, they've not yet, but they're struggling to reach ML3. And so then you can be rest assured that the medicines are of quality. Africa CDC, as I mentioned, they're focusing on procuring for health emergencies and at continental level, so that Africa is able to respond to any massive outbreaks or demands for medicines, and coming from the experience that we have with COVID-19. And so they put in place pooled procurement programs that ensures that there are sufficient stocks for essential medicines to address these health emergencies. So as FAPMA, then we engage them so that we can get local manufacturers to participate in that program and be the suppliers of choice. And in our engagements with them, and even with Global Fund, we then try to link that to funding arrangements, because the procurement or the attainment of such or those orders requires also upgrades of facilities and so forth. So we then try to ensure that the funders and the finance banks and so forth also come into play by funding and given the guarantees that there are customers like Africa CDC, Global Fund, that they've got the money and they're able to pay, and then they can be able to then fund projects that African companies are embarking into. And the same applies with reproductive health products as well, your hormonal products, which are also complex molecules that require specialist facilities. And the cost of those facilities are such that you have to produce at regional and continental level, not at national level. So there's need then to tie in funding to accessing those markets as well, and have volume guarantees from the procurers, from the buyers for a given time, 5-10 years, and that makes it a bankable project. So those are some of the initiatives, opportunities we're looking at. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. You're very modest because you left out one critical one. You remember a few years ago, FAPMA managed to convince the Global Fund to buy 20% of their supplies from African manufacturers, provided we had companies that had reached the high quality. Unfortunately, Global Fund management has changed a lot, so that's been put onto the back burner. But I'm sure you'll be chasing that. Thanks very much, Emmanuel. You touched on 3 major issues, I think, in my way of thinking. One was market access. The other one is technology transfer. And the third, equally important, is lack of affordable finance. Let's take those 3, move it to South Africa, to Skhumbuzo. Skhumbuzo, I know you're running a successful company, a very high quality company. Tell us about your challenges that you face almost every day, uh, every week, and how we can mitigate some of those challenges and how you see really going forward in terms of African pharma, please. Thanks. You're muted. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah, no, thanks, Nazeem. I was saying, I think Emmanuel has done a fantastic job and laid, obviously, the groundwork. So I just need to come and throw in a few seats here and there. But I think maybe just before I get to the questions that you've asked and the issues I wanted to raise, I mean, just to frame my discussion by saying, I think there's a broad recognition and realization now that the aspiration and most importantly, the imperative to localize pharmaceutical production in Africa is no longer just a policy issue. You can no longer see that just from the policy lens. There's an understanding now that it's a strategic, economic, and health, and I'll add national security imperative as well. But I would also argue that we are not moving fast enough to give effect to what we all want to do as a continent. And I think broadly, what one would say is there are four major areas. I think you've already touched on three: the financing issue, the regulatory issue, which lends itself to the market access. Of course, there are certain other challenges for local manufacturers that I'll speak to. So I think let me just try and unpack, and I'll mention a few under these broad buckets that I think are holding us back, because although the intention is there, one often finds that policy and practice are misaligned at ground level. And although I'll talk obviously from a Kiara perspective, I'll also bring in, of course, conversations and discussions and the experiences of my colleagues in other pharma companies. And I think just starting with the regulatory piece, because that is the entry point into supplying and getting the funding and all of these things. We've always argued, you'd remember, Nazeem, when we started these conversations and with FAPMA and whatnot, we've always argued that African pharma is not arguing for lower standards or lower quality or all of that. We've always said that there's only one quality standard, and that's a quality standard we want to manufacture at, we want to supply the market at, right? But of course, we know it's costly. So on the regulatory side, I think we appreciate everything that has happened. We appreciate the strengthening of our regulatory systems, and the fact that we now have 10 regulators with ML3 and some even going for ML4. We appreciate the fact that AMA is there, but we still decry the fact that there's still no intentional preferences for local manufacturing, with the exception of a few regulators, Ghana, I think Ethiopia. And I think the first thing that you're saying is, if you're going to invest and if you're going to take the pain and go against the grain and do the necessary investments, buy products, do the tech transfers, is that there has to be the promise of a reward. And of course, one is not saying that you should shut out other people, but we're saying at least there should be some preference to say, if you're going to manufacture this product locally, I'm guaranteeing you an approval, assuming your dossier meets the key tenets of quality, safety, and efficacy within a given time period. Now, I know when we worked on the Ethiopian pharma sector strategy, we proposed 1 month, they accepted 1 month. I know Ghana is 6 months. Other countries, I think Algeria is 6 months. In most of our other countries, You can be a local manufacturer, you can come and invest 25, 30, $40 million. They'll still approve your registration in 2 years or 3 years. And I think that is absolutely wrong and we need to change that. Also, just to put another point there and say, if that kind of non-fiscal incentive is put in place, it's also going to incentivize companies from India, from China, from Europe, who want to enter the market quickly with their own products, to come and partner with locals for tech transfers, transfer of skills, and everybody wins, because ultimately what we are trying to do is to build local industry, to prepare for the next pandemic, to have health security, and to build resilient health systems. So that's the one thing that I would say. And very closely related to that, you see these long lead times for variation approvals. We have an experience where we've got a tech transfer for a very, very important molecule. It's on tender. It's used at massive volumes. We put the product on stability, generated all the data, submitted to the regulators in these markets of interest, and it's now been several months. We still don't have approval. Once we get that approval, the Indian entity that did the tech transfer has given a commitment that we are giving this volume to you, at least a substantial part of those volumes to us to manufacture. This is a no-brainer. If you want to promote local manufacturing, companies shouldn't have to wait for 6 or 7 or 8 months for a variation to be approved. You should actually put it on a fast track and say, this is promoting local manufacturing, an important ARV. I'm going to do this, I'm going to evaluate this variation in a month or so and approve. It certainly can be done. I think the other issue that was mentioned, obviously, is around the regulatory systems and the strengthening of regulatory systems, which we absolutely welcome. The setup of AMA, we absolutely welcome that, because the situation to date has been that even if you wanted to enter some of your neighboring countries to try and create a regional market, just the cost of getting your product approved in 5, 6, 7 different countries is prohibitive for small countries. If you're a multinational from Europe, from India, from the US, to come and pay $100,000 maybe in regulatory fees is not as painful as for a small local company. So I think that's one thing that if we are serious about promoting local manufacturing, we really need to fast track again the AMA framework and get countries to come on board so that we make things a lot easier for our companies. Last point, and then I think I've been talking about this a lot, to say we know there was a place for WHO pre-qual. We know why it had to be there. We also know that with the ML3 regulators that we have, the need for that is certainly not as acute as it was before. Because from a simple, just a financial point of view, again, as a small local entity, if you're going to then register products, let's assume I wanted to be in East Africa, West Africa, North Africa, Southern Africa. If you're going to register in 10, 12 countries and then still have to carry the cost of a WHO pre-qualification and the time it takes for a regulatory team to be diverted from other products to be, it just imposes a constraint that our companies definitely do not need. So I would argue that we need to relook the costs, we need to simplify the process, and you need to make sure that our companies are able to get their products into the market a lot quickly, especially when there is an absolute commitment to manufacture these products locally. Let me just turn and pivot and just look at the demand side. I think we all know that our markets are relatively small. That's why the imperative for pulling procurement and for going regionally is so important, and it's so crucial to get that done quickly. So what are the implications as a manufacturer? Everybody knows that efficiencies come from scale, right? If you are able to campaign production, if you are able to buy your API at scale and negotiate, you can negotiate better with your suppliers, you can get better pricing and all of that. But if you supply in some of our countries, I look at our neighbors around South Africa, populations of 2.5 million. Batches are not going to be huge. When you look at the tender volumes that are called for, it calls for split batches, it calls for smaller tenders, it calls for inefficiencies, it calls for higher prices, and everybody says, oh, African companies can compete. We can compete if you give us the right volumes. And I think, as we've said before, there's certainly sufficient evidence from work by the likes of McKinsey and HERA and others in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, that when the volumes are there, our local companies can actually put products on the market cheaper than some Indian suppliers. That is published. We know that that's true. Then you look at some of the challenges that you also face, Nazeem, and I think with all the challenges that you're seeing in the Middle East, those of us who are manufacturers are already, hyperventilating. Forex movements have significant impacts on us. So you win a tender, the tender board will tell you that we allow you 4 price increases a year at this period, that period, that period. If something extraordinary happens and the movement is above a certain threshold, 15%, whatever, maybe they might consider an extraordinary increase. In the private market in a country like South Africa, you have a single exit price. This is a regulated thing. You cannot willy-nilly increase pricing because your own cost base has gone up. So to put it in perspective, at the end of last year, the Minister of Health granted us an SEP increase of 1.47%, right? 1.47%. Your labor costs probably go up by about 10%, especially in the unionized environment. Electricity maybe 15%. You have transportation costs, this, that. Your increase is 1.47%. And then you have this conflagration that you are seeing in the Middle East, which is clearly going to have an impact sooner or later. So again, this is a challenge that you're facing, that you have these shocks, but you're very constrained about how you are able to react as a company. It makes products unviable, especially in the tender environment where you're already dealing with single digit margins. It really makes it difficult to compete. There are other issues just to look at, of course, if you like Kiara or maybe +5 for some of our companies, and you're competing against one of the Indian majors with a basket of what they had 900 products. It again makes it difficult because what we are finding is that your courier houses, your chronic houses prefer to deal with companies that have broader baskets, right? If the basket is bigger administratively, it's easier for them. If you go there and you say, I want to supply you, I have a basket of 40 or so products, it's a very difficult or different conversation from someone who says, I have 300 products, I can carry so much of your chronic disease burden, cardiovascular, diabetes, CNS, this, that. So again, simple things, but that have a significant impact. Then I think something that is really a challenge for most of us on the continent, our primary and high volume purchaser is the government. And what do you see when you're dealing with government? Inconsistent procurement patterns. For example, some tenders, let's say you take a tender in country A for maternal and child health products, it will be issued or floated and the time duration is 2 years. After 2 years, the same tender comes out, it's now 1 year. So you have this inconsistent procurement patterns when it comes to the duration of the tender, the volumes that are procured, the choice of products that are procured, which makes it very difficult for us to plan in the long term. And of course, besides this inconsistent procurement patterns, the government, or we find that governments are also inconsistent, biased with inconsistent or delayed payment patterns. I mean, these are the norm. Wherever you go, it creates cash flow challenges for companies who have to pay their suppliers overseas. Normally, it's prepayment. You end up having, because if you don't, let's say your API supplier in China or India, if you do not secure your API enough to supply the tender volumes that have been pledged to you, if you do not secure it at certain points, you might miss your slot in the production line. which means then you'll not be able to supply the tender you've been awarded, which means that you'll suffer from buyouts. Your record becomes suspect and has impacts down the line for your performance in future tenders. So what do? You buy in this inventory, you stock up and you tie up cash in huge amounts of inventory. You manufacture, you supply, and if you're lucky, you're looking at maybe 9 to 10 months before you convert and you get paid by the governments, because as I said, they are notoriously slow with their payments. They will pay, but it's often delayed, right? So I think that is one of the issues that we face. Then I think something that we are seeing a lot of, and I said there's intent, there's a move from the policy to the strategic economic imperatives to the national health security imperatives, but we find that procurement boards are still being taken for a ride by certain suppliers from overseas and certain importers. A tender will specifically state that we want locally manufactured product. People will bid and say we are going to supply locally, right? And we've seen instances even in South Africa where a country that was a liquids manufacturer claimed that they would supply a fixed dose combination ARV in the duration of that tender. They didn't. Of course, they were not going to be able to meet that, tech transfers, get the side change approved and all of that. But the point is companies are still gaming the system and saying they are manufacturers when they are not. And then after they awarded the tender, they bring in finished product from overseas. We saw recently when the South African Minister of Health was in Parliament and the chair of the Portfolio Committee actually asked and said, what proportion of the ARVs that you are buying are actually manufactured locally? The minister didn't have the full number, the exact number, and the chair of the Portfolio Committee said, I'm going to tell you 70% that is imported because I got these numbers from the trade figures of the Indian So this is one of the things that we need to address to say, if you're going to say you're manufacturing locally, and it turns out that you're just doing this to play or game the system, there should be significant penalties to discourage this kind of thing because it is dangerous for health security going forward. It is dishonest and it needs to be punished severely, I would argue. The other thing that I just want to address as well on the demand side is, this argument that we have to buy, lower price products because the budgets are constrained. Yes, I have sympathy with it and understand why someone in health would hold that position. But the reality, again, on the ground is you have a situation where you lose a tender to someone who's coming at the lowest price. 3 months after the tender is awarded, they go back to the same procurement agency and they say, sorry, I made a mistake with my packaging, or I didn't include this, or my API has gone up. If you don't give me a 30% increase, I'm not going to supply, right? They are basically holding procurement agencies and central medical stores hostage. So I think we really need to go back and look at this issue of price versus cost. Are we getting value for money by buying cheap? Or this is just another way some skilled operators use to play the system. And we have evidence. I mean, we've been collecting from different countries where this is something that happens a lot. Of course, on the supply side, things are not perfect as well. We know that the fact that we operate in an environment where we have very limited or weak supporting and related industries lends itself to us having to carry huge amounts of inventory, as I said, API, excipients, lab consumables, change parts and all of that, because if something goes wrong, you do not have the luxury of having to wait for 6 weeks or 2 months to get a change part from Germany or Italy, or to get new consumables, from the US, or if you are using EU standards, all of that. So that is a big challenge that we're still facing. And if we could manage to address things like that, I argue that it would obviously lower the cost of local manufacturers, optimize cash utilization, and allow us to be more productive. One issue that we never really address as industry, we also have to be honest and agree that productivity in our plants is nowhere near the levels that you see in the East, for example. There's still a lot of work that we need to do there. There's a lot of training that you need to do, and some of us don't invest. We do not do what we need to do, but if we can get that right, I think it would go a long way towards giving us the efficiency that we need. I think the issues of limited plant utilization, Emmanuel has already spoken about the 70%. If we are operating at, below optimal capacities, obviously we cannot achieve maximal operational efficiencies. It becomes difficult to compete with imports. Then we perpetuate this saying that, oh, you are too expensive, I can't give you the volumes and all of that. I don't know how we break this, but if we can have, in my view, long-term or framework contracts, 5, 10 years, I think Emmanuel mentioned, it would certainly go a long way to assisting local companies. I mean, other issues, unreliable electricity supply and all of that, we all know, so I won't belabor those. I just want to try and maybe finish with the financing element. Nazeem, you mentioned the 3 billion from African Development Bank. We've heard of 2 billion EIB and this one here in Afrexim. And the reality is all of this is not translating into traction on the ground. When I talk to my colleagues at FAPMA, Emmanuel, yourself, Nazeem, we hear the same story. Either the ask was below the threshold, or I didn't give them enough. But what is enough? When have these institutions called us and said, African farmer, let us come and sit in a room and take you through how you prepare a bankable business case and how you make it easy for us to fund you? We hear, again, as I said, lots of talk, but we see very little action. And I personally am at a point where I'm thinking a lot of it is so that people can assuage their consciences and say they are doing something, because we are not seeing it flow into the ground across the board on the continent. 1 or 2 cases here and there, but honestly, we are not seeing that. And I just want to say again, I mean, you negotiate and you secure partnerships and tech transfer agreements. I'm sitting on a tech transfer agreement for TLD, TAFID, a host of other ARVs, for the dapivirine ring, for a medtech device that can, molecular test at the point of care, right? 20 minutes to result, gonorrhea, chlamydia, malaria, COVID, viral, I can go on and on and on. Getting funding for those things is becoming impossible, because the first question that you asked is, do you have a guaranteed offtake? Now, who's going to give you a guaranteed offtake that is multi-year? It again goes back to the funding issues to show that the financiers do not understand the procurement processes of either our governments or the procurement agencies. Nobody's going to give you a guaranteed offtake for 5 years. Global Fund works with certain cycles. Governments have 2 or 3 tender cycles. Yes, we are trying to negotiate longer time periods. But for a financier off the bat to say, I want to see a guaranteed offtake for a minimum of 3 years, they're basically telling you, go away. They just don't maybe have the guts to use, French or more appropriate, whatever. But that's the reality, that we need to start looking at how we address those things, because unless we address those, we can sign all the tech transfer agreements we need. If you do not have the money to buy the equipment, to get the tech transfers done, to get these products through WHO, PQ, or EMA, or FDA approvals, if they have to be, we are not going anywhere, right? And the last point on the financing issue, again, our second last point is, it's strange how many funders, I'm talking from private equity to banks, if you go to them and you say, I've won this tender, this is what I have, this is what it means over the next 2 or 3 years, and you want to borrow against that, it's strange how many of them will give you the cold shoulder. No, government is an unreliable payer, government this, government that. Everybody knows governments will pay you at the end of the day. It might be delayed, but they'll pay you. But you go with something like that, which you think is a bankable, whatever, and the financiers tell you, no, sorry, it's government. I'll only trust blue chip clients if you're doing something for a multinational, or come talk to me, but don't come talk to me about banks, delayed payments and all of that. So again, one challenge. The last point I just want to say, and I think Geoffrey Banda coined this term, we must get to a point where we use government procurement as a financial asset for local companies. We are not doing it. How do we do that? I think I mentioned it earlier to say, if we can convince our governments, if we can convince APPM, and if we can convince the SADC and the ECOWAS and the EAC and the IGAD pool procurement systems to agree that for locally manufactured products, we are going to give a minimum of 5-year contracts, right? Fixed volumes, 5 years, they will transform this industry. The 600 companies that you spoke about, Nazeem, will become 1,000 and 2,000 and 3,000. We will have somewhere to go, because right now, the way our procurement goes, as you all know, we are just sending our volumes out of the continent. We are just creating jobs and building new plants in other territories. And to sort this out, something like this long-term framework contracts that you're talking about, it doesn't require the fiscus to commit any more money. You're just saying, instead of a 1-year or 2-year tender, I'm converting this into a 5 or 8-year process, which allows companies like ourselves to plan better, secure better pricing for our inputs, plan production better, campaign, all of those things, bigger batch sizes, and eventually we'll be able to compete. I have a host of other issues, but I think Emmanuel covered a lot. You've covered some of these things. No need to rehash. I think maybe it's best if we close off here, and then we can go into the discussion. Thanks, Nazeem.
Thanks, Skhumbuzo. That's very, very useful. Let me just come on the finance thing. As I think some of you will know, I've spent the last 2 years working with the African Development Bank, and I must admit I was very surprised at the lack of understanding of what pharmaceutical companies need, right? Remember, DFIs are coming from big sovereign projects where they are happy to give $100 million, but not $5 million. And what I would like to say in a positive sense is that I know that the African Development Bank the intention is there. They really want, they've got the money, they really want to give it out. But internally, their processes don't fit that. And hopefully, I've managed to convince a little bit of that company, but of the bank, to say, look, set up a separate SME division and put pharmaceuticals into that. Don't consider pharmaceuticals in the same division as building an airport or 100 miles of a tarmac road. It's a completely different way of thinking. And I also recommended that when you start this new division, recruit new people so that they don't come with this mindset of 10 million is too small, the due diligence is a nightmare. So I think they're slowly but very slowly moving the right way, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. So I think there's some positive sort of clouds in the distance, but we'll have to wait for a while.
I think the fundamental question that they need to ask themselves, and all the funders, is what is the cost of health security? Or let me rephrase, what is the cost of national security? Because this is what you're talking about. It's not about a 15 million in equipment, this, that. Have we forgotten COVID? It's the scars of COVID have barely healed. It's 5 years ago. What is the cost of national sovereignty and security? Because if we can ask, we start with that question, then I think the way we phrase and we craft these instruments will change significantly.
Exactly. And I think as Emmanuel reminded all of us, that now we've got an African president who's a pharmaceutical champion, Ruto from Kenya. And hopefully we can now work with him as FAPMA and start moving things a little bit faster. I hope. Yeah. I hope that will be. I don't know if anybody who has any questions. I know we've time is of the essence, but I think we still have I'm sure we can take a few more minutes if anybody has a question. I've noticed, I don't want to put him on the spot, but I've noticed we've talked a little bit about APIs. It's a major issue for all of us because unless we can break that reliance on India and China, we'll never be really as self-sufficient as we'd like to. I believe Hannes is there. Hannes runs a company in Pretoria that's making APIs. Hannes, would you be prepared to just spend 2 minutes and tell us where you are and what the challenges are? I don't know if is he still there?
Afternoon, Nazeem. Thank you for putting me on the spot. Appreciate that.
What are friends for, Hannes?
Exactly, all over the world, Nazeem. Nazeem, yeah, thank you for this. I think the issues that we face are similar to what Skhumbuzo and Emmanuel has raised before in terms of affordable funding, the commitment to take off of your product. Obviously, we don't sell to the final end user, but to companies like Skhumbuzo and Emmanuel. But they need to have a confirmed takeoff so that they can provide us with the volumes and the numbers which we require for the investment that is necessary for API manufacturing. And API manufacturing is slightly different from final product manufacturing in the sense that it's also very capital intensive, but your lead times on the design and construction and validation is much longer because a lot of the equipment needs to be imported. So there are lead times around that, and one has to pay upfront for this. So a big capital investment with a long runway before you start making money, and obviously, therefore, very critical to have the market so that you can recover those funds. Not only recover the funds for the investment that you've made now, but being able to start investing in the next phase of drugs or APIs that need to be manufactured. We've had the stats going from infectious diseases to the impact of non-communicable diseases. And at this stage, from an API perspective, I think the companies looking at APIs in Africa are mostly looking at infectious diseases. So we haven't even touched on the non-communicables or the higher value products such as oncology. And for that, you need research capacity. Technology transfer certainly has a place to play. To play, but if we want to be truly independent and competitive, we have to be able to develop our own technology. So we need to train our scientists, we need to train our quality control analysts, we need to train our regular people to support what it takes to develop technology around API manufacturing and API process development. I'm not talking about drug discovery, I'm really only talking about API manufacturing and what it takes to have an independent, competitive API industry on the African continent. CPT Pharma has been going at this now for 10 years, and we're now beginning to see some traction. The same issue in terms of funders, yeah, they're too big or too small, too early or too late in the process, or you don't have a take-off commitment. So the way that we fund pharma companies in Africa, we really have to look at that seriously. I understand African Development Bank has got $3 billion to spend. We've spoken to them, they've gone quiet. I think that there's still a high level of risk averseness from the investors in this industry. But I also think that there's enough evidence across the continent to show that we can manufacture high quality, high value products in Africa using African technology and African trained scientists and operators. So it's true we're beginning to see that the needle is moving, but I think way too slow for what we want to do and what we should be able to do because the next wave is already coming. I think people have forgotten about COVID. So it's not to say it's not going to happen again, and we're nowhere near being prepared to deal with such a pandemic again.
Thanks, Hannes. Again, I'm sorry I put you on the spot, but I think it's very important for people to understand that there are things happening in the API field in Africa. Yeah. And you're right.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate that, Nazeem.
No problem at all. One thing I would say is, Emmanuel, maybe you need to connect with Hannes because they're not part of FAPMA as such, but maybe with FAPMA it'll help both of us, right? I noticed Martin Nicholson was putting his hand up from WHO. Martin, are you there? Would you like to?
Thanks, Nazeem. Yeah, I appreciate it. Just to flag the fact, yeah, I work for WHO on the mRNA tech transfer program, but I'm speaking here independently. I just had a question. It follows on actually from Skhumbuzo's last comment on regional procurement. So I guess the question is, how close are we to a functioning regional pool procurement mechanism? And the follow-on is, what do we need to do to accelerate to actually operationalize that so it can start to address some of the challenges which Emmanuel, Nazeem, and Skhumbuzo talked about?
Yeah. So look, I mean, you are, how's it, Martin?
Hi.
See, now I'm saying, I mean, if you look at APPM has already, the African Pool Procurement Mechanism has already floated 5, tenders, if you will, right? I think the last one closed towards the end of last year. Tala has just joined as a director there to buttress the team. This thing is moving. I mean, the initial seed funding, I think it's about $300 million or something from Afrexim Bank. What we need to do, FAPMA members, is to push our governments and whatever to join this bus, but it's moving and with the right speed. I think Emmanuel mentioned the Africa CDC, and that's the one thing that you have to say, that there's the right agency and the right speed, and we need to get behind it. So APPM is on the go. We've already seen those tenders. When they'll be awarded, I don't know. The IGAD regional procurement theme for maternal and child health products was finalized. I think it was sometime last year. There are a couple of others that we are aware are coming. Obviously, in the SADC region, Tanzania is leading a process for SADC. ECOWAS, they've done this before where they've jointly procured ARVs. I think it's just a question now of really putting in, all the effort, making sure that, again, institutions such as African Development Bank, Afrexim Bank, Trade and Development Bank, come to the party, provide some of this seed funding that is needed to get this to start, because not only is it going to give us the benefits that we know we need, but we also know that it will help this country significantly. And maybe just as an aside, we know that some of our countries are still paying 10, 12, 20 times what their neighbors are paying, right? 8 times the international reference prices. And I think the imperative for these pool procurement schemes to get ahead is there, and we are seeing traction, especially from Africa CDC level. Thanks.
Yeah. Martin, are you okay with that response?
Yes, great. Thank you. Thanks, Skhumbuzo.
Okay. There's a question on chat from Nabila Marusi. Quite a few questions.
Sorry, Nazeem. Can I just add what?
Yes, of course.
I mean, based on our experiences with the pool procurement initiatives that have taken place at regional association level, I think the participation of states is very important. In most cases, these pool procurement programs are put in place by external funders or donors with the good intentions, and it becomes more of like an academic exercise, which does not transform itself into practical reality on the ground. And to the extent that in some cases the system does not reach the potential that it's supposed to. For example, they talk of, if I can just relate to regional experiences that has happened in our region, wherein they will put in place a database. For example, they negotiate with suppliers at a certain price, offtake price, to say if you're going to buy, for argument's sake, a certain drug, then the supply is assured of such volumes and at such a price. Then when it comes now to national level, most of them have got their own procurement systems, which don't open up to be able to use the facility that is at regional level for pool procurement. And, citing sovereignty, misalignment between their, procurement policies and laws and so forth. So, and I agree that if used effectively, it can, to a great extent, open up volumes for African manufacturers. If you negotiate and say, we're going to supply you, we're going to buy from you a certain product for 5 years, and these are the volumes that are guaranteed, I'll be sure to know that every year I'm producing these volumes, and I can go and look for funding, and with the content that I'm going to produce these volumes. But if we agree, then the procurement levels are such that it's less than 10% of the volumes that I've agreed with you, and at a price that is running at 100%. So it becomes unviable. So you find that it can be agreed at regional level, and but the states don't participate in that, in as much as the political expression that we are going in with the food procurement system. But the one at Africa CDC, it's being handled at Africa CDC level and at continental level. So the decision making, one can assume, is at that level, and the procurement decisions are done at that level, and it doesn't have to a great extent, rely on countries coming in and making their decisions. So, and I think it points out to some of the sentiments that were expressed by Skhumbuzo, to the extent that there's a lot of money that is involved in these things, and there's a lot of vested interest, some of it that works contrary to the public interest or public health interest, and it's something that needs to be addressed. But otherwise, I think if you look at there's been a lot of food procurement initiatives that have taken place, but most of them have not taken off, partly because of non-participation and buy-ins from governments and so forth. Okay, but I think it's something that needs to be addressed, really. And also the funders towards they come in as well. Thank you.
Right. I'm just going to go back to Nabila's questions. I've just read them. They're all very pertinent. Nabila, if you don't mind, can I suggest, Kiara, if you can link Nabila to the three of us with those questions, so we can take our time and have a discussion with her, if that's okay? Hope you forgive us.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. And I think similarly, Gertrude's got a question, which I think the answer is yes. Gertrude, we need to work closely with the financiers so they better understand the importance of APIs. We'll certainly need to do that. Finally, I can see Dhiren is sort of a bit edgy. Dhiren, a question or a comment, or you want to close?
Well, there are other questions ahead of me, but my question was that a lot of discussion today was focused on what government can do, or multinational organizations like Global Fund. My question was, what is the role of private sector? Not the manufacturers, but other aspects of private sector that can weigh into either success or not such a good success of the growth of this industry.
Skhumbuzo, you want to go first?
Happy to go first. I think over the last 10, 15 years, we've spoken to enough people to understand that there is genuine interest in some circles in this sector. But the fear is always that I'm going to come in and support, put in money, whatever. For example, if it's an investor, high net worth individual says that, but governments are buying from India and China. Where's the return, right? So that's the one element. The second element is, if you look at other players in this space that could potentially come in to play a role, they always have this thing that, again, the African market has this schizophrenic view. Yeah, this is important, but it's not really. So the first point, and your question was around, we keep talking about the role of government, because honestly, like in any other nascent industry around the world, unless government goes all in and say restrictions of imports, incentives, expedited registrations, is that nobody will take this seriously. We need that strong signal to say, hey, we're in. And by the way, I'm in Addis now, in Ethiopia. That's exactly what the government is doing here. We have this unique situation where local manufacturers are supplying less than 20% of the public tender. The government has said, I'm giving you 50% or even more if you can supply, right? Because they're so serious that expedited registrations, incentives, export credits. When you win a tender in Ethiopia, the government gives you a price preference of 25%. You get a 30% prepayment to buy in your raw material so you can produce. If you need more, they'll even give you more. You just see the tender to the government bank that, so these are the kind of things that we need, because
Right.
if you have that, they will come. And we've seen with Bangladesh, with all these countries, that this is what happens. Coming back, maybe just to tie it into your question, but also to what Gertrude brought about. Hannes is here, he's modest, the processes that would allow them to compete with anybody, right? If our governments, either at the regional or even South Africa with the HIV burden that we have, if our governments just said 50% of the ARVs that we buy are going to be manufactured with API that is procured locally, I guarantee you CPT would be one of the most competitive API suppliers in the next 5 to 10 years. It's a simple decision, and we are not willing to take it as policymakers.
And there's a difference. We are 54 countries, right? India is one, and we can learn from what India has managed to do. Emmanuel, any more comments on that? Question from Darren?
Yeah. I mean, just to add on to what Skhumbuzo said. I mean, for example, in our country, government procurement is estimated to be more than 60% of the total market. And given that significance, and it used to account at some time for 70% of the pharmaceutical market. And the private market was only accounting for 30%. So if you are looking at those numbers, it is a no-brainer to see the important role that government can play. And if government is buying and is a credible client in terms of payments, there's nothing that is as strong as a government guarantee or a government purchase order. And I think it's like that if you go to the US, Europe, and so forth. A government order is more viable than even a private sector order, because you're sure that government will never default, government will always pay. And that in itself becomes a vehicle in terms of driving the industry. And the problem we face in Africa is that Africa is considered as a very high risk economic market from a bankable perspective and investment perspective as well, to the extent that high premiums are then placed when anyone who wants to invest in Africa. The returns that they ask for are much more than what you expect if you are going to another country in Europe or in what so-called stable markets. And if you look at the genesis in terms of the development of the Indian pharma industry, it was government, nothing else. It was government. I remember there was an experience where I think Indira Gandhi then was the Prime Minister of India. Then there was a policy that was put in place to the extent that amoxicillin then was on patent, and an Indian manufacturer was then given the order to supply all the amoxicillin. And I think it was GSK and even Margaret Thatcher had to appeal Gandhi and say, what is this that is happening that you have shut out the and it was just a stroke of a pen, a government decision. So and everything, government are the ones who put in place the necessary policies that drive industries, and those policies influence the industry in various ways. And so it's at policy level. I'll give you an example. We do get some spares for our machinery from India, China, and so forth. Sometimes we have to send samples, products, so that they can come up with a customized sort of parts that are obviously consistent with the product that we're producing. It is almost impossible to send a sample to India or China. It's almost impossible. At one time, we have to go through the list of their trade mission here. After we've had almost 3 consignments being seized because they are tablets and they're considered as pharmaceutical products, and they're not allowed to go into that country. And if you look at countries like, I'll give you an example. I didn't want to talk about particular countries. But if you look at a country like Egypt, for example, Egypt, they are producing almost 90% of their medicines at the moment.
Yeah.
And what has caused that? It's government. They buy, and Indian pharma industry is now turning over more than 7 billion a year and supplying the major supply in the Arab world and so forth. It's just policies that have been put in place. And if you put the right policies, the demand is created, the players come into play because it becomes viable for you to invest in that industry. And so it has to start at that level, really. And the private sector, yes, it has become prominent because of the fact that in some cases the public health system has collapsed and people are now relying on the private sector for their medicines or their health requirements. That's why sometimes in other African states you find that the private sector is now playing a major role, but it is also subject to the policies and also the temperament of the economies and other, like exchange rate and so forth. Okay, thank you.
I think we've taken a lot of time now. I'd like to really give a huge vote of thanks to both Emmanuel and Skhumbuzo. Thank you so much, guys, for sharing your insights. I'm sure they've been very valuable. But we've talked a lot about challenges, but I just want to finish on a high. Almost of all parts of the world, pharmaceuticals are under tremendous pressure in terms of pricing. Margins are eroding like crazy. And that's one area where I think Africa will lead the world, particularly in generics, where we can still produce, generics at a decent price and hopefully get reasonable margins. That's an opportunity. The other opportunity is, sadly, our disease profile is changing dramatically. We know we're going into non-communicable diseases, cancers, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes. Those are all chronic diseases, which is a big opportunity again for manufacturers. And finally, I think we've already touched on the fact that there are lots of things that African Union is beginning to do, which I think we need to make sure that those messages are strengthened through our own politicians. And in doing that, I think we will succeed, and I hope we'll become the next India in about 15, 20 years in terms of generics, really. Because
Yes.
India is now finding it difficult as well, right? Because their
Yes.
costs are all going up. So on that note, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Dhiran. I don't know whether you want to say last few words. And before I go, Kiara, can you get all the questions and then send them to us so we can answer them, please?
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, guys, we couldn't answer all of them.
Absolutely.
Dhiran?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to thank Kiara and her and Med Aditus team to continue to produce high quality, programs. I think these are very important discussions, and just kudos to them for picking good topics and then bringing excellent panelists and really informing really the public and the stakeholders. So really appreciate Kiara for the continued sort of high quality of webinar programs that you produce.
My pleasure. Thank you all for being part, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a wonderful it's a wonderful hour and a half. I think I'm very, very happy that we are discussing very important topics. This one is definitely at the top of the list. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye then.